Hi, all. Happy April, and welcome to episode 5 of Father-Offspring Interviews. We're getting right into it today with our first question, which came from Val from Finland. And they ask, do you know of any examples of a human group where they lost all their aggressive and mean baboons' personalities by some tragedy and then thrived and flourished?
Great question, Val from Finland. I don't know of any example, and this is harking towards my baboons where all the aggressive males in one troop were killed by tuberculosis. It left everyone with this much more peaceful social culture afterward. But since you are from Finland, I'm going to tell, to my understanding, how did Sweden become Sweden? Because I think it's another version of my baboon troop. Okay, 18th century, the Swedes were these crazy ass militaristic people who were just rampaging all over Europe. They were fighting Peter the Great, they were fighting everywhere. And by around the time of Napoleon, they were beginning to poop out a bit and were losing a bunch of wars. And it was around 1815, and the King of Sweden was looking kind of deathbound and happened to have no offspring. So all the nobles met there and said, we've got to go hire a new king for after he dies. And they were trying to figure out how to do this. And one of the nobles remembered in one of the prior Swedish wars against the French, he had been taken as a prisoner of war. And there was a colonel, a French colonel, who was very kind to the prisoners and was a good guy all around. And like our noble said, wow, I wonder if he's still around. If he is, we should hire him. He would make a great king. And it turned out the guy by now was a general with Napoleon. And they went and said, do you want to be our king? And he had to ask Napoleon for permission to go. And Napoleon said, sure, just never fight against us French. And he said, I cannot promise that on the behalf of my beloved Swedish countrymen. So he became king. And I think what was most interesting was this was one of the most experienced, war-thickened leaders in all of Europe. All he had been doing was fighting wars with Napoleon. And he was kind of getting to that stage of life of deciding this is kind of a crazy way to spend your life. And he also got to Sweden and looked around and said, yeah, maybe they were impressive 50 years ago, but they've been pushed back enough that they're this piddly little country. They can't keep doing this war stuff because they're going to get trounced every time. And he had this absolutely inspired notion that maybe we Swedes, because he was by that point, we Swedes, maybe we should take our pride not by what areas we conquer, what lands we occupy, but how well we take care of our citizens, how well we take care of our elders and babies. And he started the transformation of Sweden into becoming the Swedish Scandinavian model of governments actually caring about their people. So I don't think he was not gotten out of the scene with tuberculosis. He just had a remarkable change of life and was savvy enough to see, give it up, Swedes. Why don't you try to become a different sort of country? Let's become a nice one. And they haven't had a war since in more than 200 years.
Our next question from Harry from New York is, was Freud right? By observation, did he understand major structures of the brain, such as the superego and the newest section of the frontal cortex and the id with the amygdala?
Oh God, Freud. Well, it's obligatory to trash him, and I would happily do so. He did do some good things. He was revolutionary in his time, with the notion that thought is not sin, and that was pretty liberating. And he had some extremely insightful stuff to say about depression. He was not a neuroscientist. Okay, in a very rough way, the frontal cortex that keeps you from doing impulsive, stupid things has kind of a super ego-ish feel to it. The amygdala, aggression, fear, all of that, it-ish, but not really. It's much more a metaphor. And it really doesn't hold up when you think about the frontal cortex in terms of just how complicated of a part of the brain this is. You're sitting there, you're being tempted to lie about something and you're trying to resist. You're using your frontal cortex, very super egoish. But then you decide, what the hell, I am going to lie. And then you use your frontal cortex to do a good job at lying, to make sure your voice doesn't crack and you maintain eye contact, and all this is a part of the brain that's both helping you resist the pull of temptation, and then once you wallow in it, to do a good job. This is not just super ego, it's a slightly useful metaphor, but not much more than that.
Next, Maria from Athens, Greece asks, is aggression at the same level as it was thousands of years ago?
Well, this is one of the perpetual people at each other's throats at conferences arguing about the nature of peace. So, have humans been violent savages all the way back to 6, 7 million years ago when we last had a common ancestor with chimps? And it's only been since the Enlightenment that suddenly things are getting a little bit better, if you have a fairly sort of narrow view of what's going on in the world. Alternatively, we're humans by nature, not necessarily warlike and aggressive and all of that, and that's a much more recent invention, and I am emphatically of the latter school. When you look at the paleontological records, when you look at what contemporary hunter-gatherers are about, when you look at all of that, you see that intergroup conflict, organized violence that would look like warfare, all of that. You really don't see that while humans were being nomadic hunter-gatherers, which, as the cliche goes, was like 99% of human history. It's not till you start getting sedentary. Hunter-gatherers who, by this lake in northern Kenya, Lake Turkana, settled down there over a really good fishing hole. They became sedentary, and you get the first evidence there of some sort of massacre. Basically, things were just fine until humans made their all-time bad move, which was inventing agriculture. Okay, I have a shtick about this. Agriculture, idiotic invention. Agriculture, like you go from subsisting on like 200 different wild plants in your hunter-gathering to just a handful of crops, so you're vulnerable to potato blights and droughts and all that sort of thing. But mostly what agriculture allowed was surplus stuff. And as soon as there was surplus stuff, humans invented having unequal distribution of the surplus stuff. And you invented hierarchy, and you invented have-nots, and you invented envy for the folks across the way there because they got more stuff than you. And that's when you see warfare suddenly taking off. So this has not been a common feature of humans for the vast percentage of our history. This is not to say hunter-gatherer males are not perfectly happy to kill some other male if he thinks that he's sleeping with someone or other that he shouldn't. Individual male-male violence is the same level as anywhere else. But in terms of organized violence, it's controversial. People really yell at each other, but I am absolutely of the school of the peace anthropologists who say that you didn't get organized warfare until humans settled down and started having material cultures. That's where we went wrong.
The next question is a follow-up from our last video. So a viewer asked, okay, what do you do in the USA that would be seen as mentally ill in East Africa? Inquiring minds want to know.
Okay, well, that's an allusion to last week. I was talking about cross-cultural aspects of psychiatry, how varied it could be. And I noted that there's some things I do that's perfectly normal here in the United States that would count as a psychiatric disorder in East Africa, where I've done my work. For example, during my postdoc, which was in San Diego, I rented a place and I lived there for 2 years. And I feel absolutely certain that during that time, I never once spoke to my neighbors. I don't think I ever even saw them because I was having to do a lot of lab work and I was there 80 hours a week and sleeping there a lot. And if you got somebody in East Africa who had been living somewhere for 2 years and had never spoken with their neighbors, let alone never sat down and had a long conversation about how everybody's cows and chickens were, this would be considered very, very abnormal socialization. Speaking of all that, you know this story, but back when mommy was in grad school, clinical psych, one of the years we were in Kenya, we decided to do a busman's holiday for her, and we visited the 3 psychiatric hospitals in Kenya, which were amazing in terms of just how different of a world. This was many decades ago. So she was there talking with people there and such. And we eventually got to the 3rd place, which was way out in the middle of nowhere in the Rift Valley. This was the chronic care hospital. Every single person there had been there for at least a quarter century. Getting there, it was clear they'd lost most of the records on these people. Nobody knew where they were from, what their names were, whatever. People were mostly just sitting around in this yard, most of them minimal clothes, chasing the chickens, chickens chasing them, everyone seemingly having a fine time. So we showed up there, and this caused a great deal of alarm among the sort of people there because of our novel appearance or whatever, and heard at least one person sort of shout out the word jinn, which in Swahili from Arabic is like sorcerer. We were scary folks. So we were hanging out there, and suddenly from way in the back, this little old man makes this beeline for mommy. And this little old man, he's got like no clothes on and he's shuffling over. And finally, he gets up to mommy and takes her hand, and he keeps saying, Mama Amakuja, Mama Amakuja, Mama has come, Mama has come. So that's how it was there.
All right, the final question of this episode from Weston from Ohio is, what is your favorite neurotransmitter?
Oh, you have to ask. Dopamine. Of course, no, not because of an easy explanation. Ooh, dopamine's about pleasure and reward and partying and all of that and euphoria and all. No, because that's not what dopamine is about. Dopamine is not about pleasure. It's about anticipation of pleasure. It's about the motivation to do the work that's needed to get that pleasure. And it's far more about the anticipation, which is so interesting, and so interesting about us as a species, because you study that like in monkeys and you can show like a surge of dopamine when a monkey realizes, ooh, if I press this lever now a bunch of times, I'm going to get a reward. Anticipation and motivation to press it, and they maintain elevated dopamine levels this whole time, these 5 seconds before they get access to the lever. Wow, just like us. Except what do? We keep our dopamine levels anticipatorily elevated for years, for decades. We do it to study hard and get good SAT scores and then get a good GPA and then get a good job and get a good mortgage and get into the nursing home of our choice and all of that. And we're able to maintain that. There are people out there who could maintain anticipatory dopamine for reward, which in their version of the universe isn't going to come until after they're dead. We're a weird, interesting species, the way we can do that. And among other things, that explains how, like, some humans can spend 60 years trying to solve some obscure puzzle or something. We are a weird species in terms of how long we can maintain dopamine up there. So I think dopamine is the best, not because it's about pleasure, but it's because about this really way out there feature of humans. We anticipate and we anticipate, and we get pleasure from waiting for it and knowing how great it's going to be.
Well, it's a pretty good way to wrap it up here then, because that concludes the content for this episode. As always, submit questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.
And remember, vote often and early. November is looming. Okay, we're done. I'm not going to say anything more.